So welcome to the last of the panels. Dare we compare historical atrocities, comparative approaches from genocide studies to multidirectional memory. Oh, incidentally, I'm Tom Trezise, professor and chair of French and Italian at Princeton, and I have worked to some degree in Holocaust studies, which is one of the reasons I had the pleasure of having been invited by Jonathon to be part of this. I want to thank him, also Andy and Jennifer in particular, for all of the hard work that they've done. So as this title of the panel suggests, it was partly inspired by the work of Michael Rothberg, who for family reasons can't join us today. In particular, his book Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization. However, the panel was also inspired by Susan Neiman's article, History of Guilt, published in Eon, and the papers we're about to hear engage with a host of issues, from the formation and uses of a generic figure of the witness to a multiplicity of critical approaches to genocide studies, by way of the consequences for questions of race and memory, of digitalization. So following the papers, Susan Neiman will offer some concluding reflections, and then the floor will be open for questions and comments. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our three speakers, so I will be out of the way. The first one is Carolyn J. Dean, Charles J. Stiller Professor of History and French at Yale University. Carolyn specializes in the cultural and intellectual history of modern Europe, the history of gender and sexuality, genocide studies, and the Holocaust. She's the author, most recently, of Aversion and Erasure, The Fate of the Victim After the Holocaust, and forthcoming in 2019, The Moral Witness, Trials and Testimony After Genocide. The title of her talk today is The Moral Witness, the Holocaust Paradigm, and Beyond. Our second speaker is Naomi Mandel, Associate Professor of English at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Naomi's research focuses on contemporary literature and critical theory, as well as on the aesthetics and ethics of violence. She's the author of Against the Unspeakable, Complicity, the Holocaust, and Slavery in America, and of Disappear Here, Violence After Generation X. Her current work examines the visual and literary culture of the digital revolution and the information age, and her talk is entitled Unspeakable 2.0, Race and Memory in the Information Age. And finally, Dirk Moses, Professor of Modern History at the University of Sydney. Dirk's many research interests include genocide, memory, and imperial and global history. He's the author of the prize-winning book German Intellectuals and the Nazi Past, and the editor of numerous anthologies, including the Oxford Handbook of Genocide, and most recently, Post-Colonial Violence and the Question of Genocide, the Nigeria-Biafra War, 1960 to 1967 to 70, and the Holocaust in Greece. The title of his talk today is Working Through the Past as Entangled Histories, Genocide from Empire to Auschwitz and Beyond. So, Carolyn, you have the floor.
I'm a lot shorter than Tom, so yeah, this is it. Okay. Can everyone hear? All right. Okay. Thank you again to everyone for this wonderful conference that we all have the honor of being part of. Thanks to Jonathon and to Jennifer for the superb organization. I wanted to say that the last question that Julia Komska asked of the former panelists, and the former panel is a great segue into this paper and probably the entire panel, because I will address the way that genocide was made culturally legible rather than legally defined. That really is the focus, and in a more distilled fashion, I'm really going to speak about how, because genocide, as Carl Jacobi said, is always seen as the crime of crimes since the end of the Second World War, it has slightly obscured, not in any kind of malicious way, which sometimes is sometimes conceived that way, as if a Jewish lobby was somehow had made the Holocaust the most important event of the 20th century through some malevolence. But slavery has been obscured as a phenomenon in a way by, as I think everybody knows, by the crime of crimes, and has been treated as historically distinct, both because it is, but also because conceptually it's very hard to talk about the two together, and it's been true throughout this conference that the easier way of talking about them together is not historically, which is interesting. So these concepts like genocide help us talk about this kind of different forms of violence and what they might mean and how they're given meaning. And I'm talking about the trajectory from that kind of notion of, I don't want to say competitive violence, competitive constructions of violence, to the evacuation of genocide of any kind of particularity. And that is easier to talk about perhaps because the Holocaust has been unlike the genocide of Native Americans or slavery, a little bit more like lynching with a different outcome. The Holocaust has been described, the violence of the Holocaust has been described over and over, and most people have some image of what happened to people. And so it's a very different kind of, it has propelled a very different kind of discussion, okay? And so I guess finally I want to just make the point that Lemkin's concept of genocide, the one part of that legal definition was cultural genocide, and it did not make it into the convention. What cultural genocide legally now takes the form of fighting over property, all right? So it's interesting because people have asked about the connections between concepts, and that's very important because I think that part of what cultural meanings accorded to the moral witness and the witness to genocide, which is what I'll be talking about, have a lot to do with this, the question of culture and the erasure of a culture rather than rather than simply the violence targeted against bodies, literally, okay? So let me begin. I wanted to just start with these illustrations of how pervasive the concept of bearing witness has become as a central moral trope of our time. Here. I mean, you can literally, and this is my favorite, which is a series, the Bearing Witness series. It literally seems pervasive, and of course this is the outside of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. So it takes the biblical, you are my witness, and of course the moral witness is originally a biblical figure. So now I'll begin the more formal presentation. The centrality and ubiquity of the traumatized victim in contemporary Western culture has generated a great deal of ambivalence. Critics across the political spectrum have long bemoaned the victim's centrality in debates by referring to a victim competition in which victim groups ostensibly compete for a piece of the pie instead of submitting their claims to reasoned historical and policy analysis. Others argue that image of traumatized victims in humanitarian fundraising, among other images mobilized for political purposes, encourage sentimentalism and turn real victims into powerless objects of philanthropic condescension. Rather than taking the centrality of victim trauma and testimony in 21st century moral culture as a point of departure and analyzing its uses and abuses, I interpret these arguments about victims today as part of a genealogy of the moral witness to genocide. This genealogy tracks how the history of how Western Europeans and North Americans' understanding of genocide changed over time, from regrettable to unconscionable, and now to a seemingly permanent feature of modern political formations. How then has the image of the traumatized victim changed over the past half century, and with what consequences? How might we assess these changes? The thin Western consensus that developed around the Nazis' attempted annihilation of European Jewry after the 1960s turned Holocaust survivors into relatively uncontested symbols of totalitarian evil and a rationale for activism on behalf of human rights. For a long while, scholars took the link between the Holocaust and human rights to be self-evident. As one argued, the late 20th century paradigm of universal human rights was self-consciously developed to prevent what happened to Jews in the Holocaust from happening to anyone again, ever. Though this assertion has been recently contested, the victim of genocide since the Holocaust has been a privileged symbol of an increasingly global discourse of human rights that has only recently included the victims of colonial states. And this is partly because, of course, in the 1950s, there was no, legally, state sovereignty was respected, so there was not going to be any intervention on behalf of, say, minority populations targeted in various countries. And this is, of course, very important to countries like the United States, where there was Jim Crow. I use a brief assessment here, very brief, of the Eichmann trial I should say reassessment, to emphasize the continuities and change between Holocaust survivors and the new global victim of genocide, in order to suggest why the Holocaust survivor remains such a powerful cultural figure, even though, as I also argue, it was formed in a very different context from the current witness to genocide. In so doing, in the next 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes, I want to address historically how universal suffering humanity has been represented, how the universal is constituted, takes shape, and is embodied. And I should say here that, like Michael Rothberg's, I thought I should get him in one way or the other, my approach assumes that the universal is an ever-fluid construct. But unlike him in multidirectional memory, I'm a historian, and so I'm interested in how, at different times, the universal is constituted as such. The usual discussion of the witness to genocide assumes that it emerged in the form of the Jewish Holocaust survivor during the 1961-62 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. There are myriad accounts of the Israeli and broader reception of the trial, all of which assert that it marked the recognition of Jewish survivors for the first time. The survivor, as has so often been argued, became an exemplar of heroic Jewish memory. Less often emphasized, however, is a narrative that was crucial at the time and now is mostly forgotten. The trial created an alternative narrative about mass murder by relieving Jews of the stigma of having gone to their deaths without a fight. In so doing, the trial offered a narrative of survival under extreme circumstances that later became essential to defining the ravages of genocide and trauma. The Eichmann trial rendered the survivor an object of Western moral consensus by erasing the guilt and ambivalence projected onto the victims. In so doing, it rendered stigmatized victims publicly blameless, and worthy of recognition. Witness testimony was the first large public revelation, not only of the Holocaust Jewish victims, but also of the psychological suffering, and this is very important, endured by non-combatant victims targeted for extermination. Unlike resistance fighters, who were also called witnesses, of course, or war veterans even from the Great War, abolitionists in the 19th century and early 20th century, Jewish victims had to prove in the face of skepticism that they could not have resisted and that their suffering was undeserved. They had to rebut insinuations that they had gone like sheep to the slaughter, in the famous phrase by Abba Kovner, and their survival was a source of shame in Israel and of guilt and indifference elsewhere. And now I'm going to assume most of you are familiar with the Eichmann trial, but just in case, a brief review. The head of the section of the Gestapo responsible for Jewish affairs in 1941, Eichmann organized transports of Jews to death camps in Eastern Europe. He was kidnapped in Argentina by Israeli Secret Service agents, tried in Jerusalem, sentenced to death, and executed on June 1st, 1962. The prosecution's Zionist narrative turned the trial into the last stage of an epic and heroic struggle to defend the Jewish nation and redeem victims' suffering by symbolically rectifying their statelessness. Some accounts of the trial also focus on how, outside of Israel, it universalized Jewish suffering and made it accessible to non-Jews as a story about the human capacity for evil. But the trial figured survival not only in conventional historical terms, heroic terms, but also as a source of unfathomable vulnerability, more in keeping with the experiences the witnesses conveyed on the stand, in response to questions about why they had not resisted. The survivor recounted an inconceivable experience of terror, and in the process challenged assumptions about the victim's purported failure to resist Nazi persecution. These haunted figures brought into presence the terror that had rendered resistance mostly desperate and the guilt that made survival a burden. The testimonies that recount the pointlessness of resistance or escape punctuate the trial and are among its most harrowing moments. Attorney General Gideon Hausner elicited this testimony because he aimed to mind than pervasive beliefs in Jewish cowardice and complicity, even at the risk of distressing witnesses. He forced survivors to describe the effects of terror, imminent death, the price of resistance, and the power of hope, compelling observers to grapple anew with their feelings that Jews should have put up more of a fight. Hausner's questions about revolt were sometimes indirect, as when he asked why Jews continued to believe they would live in spite of what they knew about extermination camps after 1942. They could also be harsh, as in his famous interrogation of Moshe Beisky, when he noted that there were 15,000 Jews in a camp and very few SS. Why, he said, didn't they revolt? Angry at Hausner's provocation, Elie Wiesel's 1961 essay on the trial represented Jews marching to their deaths with dignity, recasting Jewish resistance in keeping with the realities of death camps and portraying Jewish survival in a new light. Testimony refashioned survival as a form of miraculous endurance rather than conventional heroism, and as the experience of devastating and unfathomable loss. The dramatic contrast between received ideas about how human beings might fight and defeat their persecutors and the terror that discouraged all but the most desperate acts of resistance describes the incommensurable gap between the public's presumptions about how people might be expected to act under such circumstances and the survivor's experience. No longer cause for shame, survivors' stories of suffering recreated a world of horror and powerlessness that transformed the trial into a space of communal mourning. The trial represented a rhetorical erasure of the moral ambivalence that clung painfully to Jewish survivors of genocide. By capturing the harrowing nature of their experiences and the utter irrelevance of questions about why they had not resisted, in spite of the effort also to celebrate, obviously, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and other acts of resistance, the trial restored their dignity. By 1976, I think not coincidentally, the year after, as our earlier speaker showed the Google Ngram, or his own version of it, the connection between ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto and the ghetto, it is 1976 that Auschwitz becomes absolutely central to Jewish memory of the Holocaust rather than ghettos. And that's probably has something to do with the displacement of ghetto, or at least the ability to use ghetto to describe urban centers in the U.S. So by 1976, the American Terence Desprez could write that heroism was no longer reserved for tragic heroes, but was commensurate with the sweep of ruin in our time. Efforts to counter victim blaming, first accomplished by the Eichmann trial, became pervasive in the United States, as critics questioned the influential work of Austrian psychoanalyst Bruno Bettelheim, who had accused Jews of going passively to their deaths. Critics outside of the Jewish community also took issue broadly with Hannah Arendt's interpretation of the complicity of the Jewish councils in the Nazi genocide. By analyzing testimonies of survivors in light of the living death experienced by Jewish Holocaust survivors, Desprez and others, like the American psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, whose work was crucial in explaining survivors' traumatic symptoms to a large audience, insisted that survival constituted the core experience of the 20th century. The survivor, Lifton wrote, becomes every man. The Holocausts of the 20th century have thrust the survivor ethos into special prominence and imposed upon us all a series of immersions into death, which mark our existence. Here, let me show my own little Google Ngram here. Here, is that it? Yeah. So this is Witness to Genocide. So what you can see is during the Eichmann trial, and then what takes over is Auschwitz, and then what happens here when there's a new interest in trauma, the PTSD, the Vietnam War memory, all of this, and it's just begun to go down recently. All right, the interest. I realize this is a bit reductive, but it gives you some sense of the trend. So there's been more recognition, is the point. And it really took off in Europe and the US around 75. I think that's not representative. It's also only in English. It's used in every single European language as well. Okay. Now survivors, Lifton conceived survivors as psychically injured people whose memory of the dead compelled them to strive for social justice. Desprez, for his part, believed they possessed a luminous truth fit for dark times. Survivors bore witness to the suffering they'd endured and insisted on vigilance toward future suffering. They provided a model of social solidarity based upon a burning address to the world, in which the once victim demanded that no one be abandoned to such a fate. After the 1970s, bearing witness to genocide became a modern secular call to moral imagination and human conscience. Survivors' witness famously turned them into secular saints. I'm speaking about Jewish Holocaust survivors. Even Raoul Hilberg, who was also mentioned by Michael, after the 1970s, Raoul Hilberg, not known for his sentimentalism, insisted that they possess special knowledge. The survivor was constituted retrospectively as a singular purveyor of knowledge central to understanding the violence perpetrated by genocidal regimes in the 20th century, sources not only of revelation but also of moral authority. More than heroism, survival expressed the unmitigated terror of industrialized violence and the possibilities for life after mass death. It gave cultural meaning to the distinct experience of genocide. Because of survivors' special attributes, the Holocaust, as many have argued, became very problematically a civil religion in Western Europe and particularly in the United States. But if there is any lesson to learn from the reception of Holocaust survival in Western Europe and the United States, it is no longer that Jewish victims were finally recognized or that survivors became saints and commemorative rituals evacuated of substance. Rather, we can make three historical and conceptual claims to bring us back to the cultural status of traumatized victims and how it has shifted. First, the symbol of the Holocaust survivor was part of a broader cultural shift since the Great War, meaning 1914 to 1918, that defined victims as authoritative sources and genocidal massacres as distinct from mass death through conquest or combat. The Eichmann trial is now so widely remembered not only because it brought recognition to the Jewish dimension of Nazi persecution, and not only because it represented the dual totalitarianisms, Nazism and communism during the Cold War, but also because it made the experience of genocide legible and meaningful as a particular experience of suffering beyond Lemkin's legal definition of the term. The Jewish genocide survivor was both a particular victim and became a symbol of universal human suffering. And this question of the nexus of the particular and individual has also been really crucial to this discussion, as far as I can tell. Second, the Eichmann trial rendered the evil of the Holocaust, and its later interpretation is much more important in doing this, a source of moral consensus in Western Europe and the United States. Jews, once berated for not having resisted their persecutors and suspected of complicity in their own deaths, were recast as innocent survivors of unspeakable violence. Because Western powers rationalized imperial conquest as subduing savagery and repressing rebellion rather than violating humanity, and also rationalized Japanese death as wartime necessity, the Holocaust survivor, rather than colonized victims of genocidal violence, came to represent Western Europeans and North Americans' discovery of their own murderousness. Even by the 1960s, there was a thin consensus against the violence colonized victims had suffered, but not against the colonial regimes that perpetrated it. It is instructive to note that the President of France only apologized for French torture of Algerians this year, at this point to no great effect in Algeria, and bemoaned the torture of a Frenchman, not an Algerian. In contrast, the consensus that developed around the Nazis' attempted annihilation of European Jewry, however belated, fragile, and contested by Holocaust denial, rendered Holocaust survivors uncontested reminders of what destruction human beings were capable. And third, because of this moral consensus regarding Jewish victims of the Holocaust, they, as I already indicated, became symbols of Western moral conscience. A decade after the Eichmann trial, Jewish survivors moved from the margins of the Holocaust to become its icons, as a new narrative of human and ecological survival developed in the 1960s and 70s. Holocaust survivors became quintessential witnesses to genocide, especially in the U.S., and shorthand for the moral obligations of Western populations to remedy the suffering of others. In spite of a myriad of other genocides since the Holocaust and the recognition of others prior to it, the globalized and Americanized memory of the Jewish survivor remains a point of comparison when genocidal violence is imagined and conveyed. The image of the global victim of genocide is no longer fashioned in the image of a wizened purveyor of hard truths. And as the ubiquity of trauma was belatedly globalized, and especially with the creation of an international court, which started operating in 2002, though there were ad hoc trials for Rwanda and Yugoslavia earlier. So as the ubiquity of this trauma was belatedly globalized, the Holocaust survivor was replaced by a symbolic global victim of genocide, in whose name we all bear witness. Activists invoke the victim as a rationale for the work of the International Criminal Court and humanitarian organizations. And I should say that we also all bear witness to atrocity photography. When we go to photography exhibitions, we are called witnesses. I don't know if anybody, it's interesting that this is what I'm, in the book at least, trying to discuss, is how we ended up all becoming witnesses, secondary witnesses or third-party witnesses. Victims have become less visible as sources of symbolic authority. Second and third-party witnesses are as important as the victims themselves. Their suffering is no longer the source of imagined insight into genocidal violence. Their tormented bond with the dead is emptied of content in favor of non-specific and timeless suffering. The global victim is a moral symbol, but in our context, when genocide has become a recognizable feature of the geopolitical landscape and serves as a metaphor for all kinds of destruction, it is mostly a haunting reminder of genocide's pervasiveness rather than a marker of an event's particularity. We might discuss whether this is true when we try to talk about genocides that have been forgotten completely. The global victim signifies a litany of seemingly interchangeable crimes, almost all in the global south, the perpetration of which have become paradoxically unsurprising occurrences by virtue of the frequent invocation and recognition of the traumatized victim. Indeed, in critics' very recognition of this paradox, there may be yet another witness figure emerging that counters this construction, this passive construction of victims, and confers authority on witnesses, second or third-party witnesses. Why is the Holocaust survivor still invoked to summon the international community to act boldly against other genocides? This is always what happens, right? The global victim now represents a new global responsibility for healing victims' wounds and signifies the ubiquity and self-evidence of trauma. It no longer symbolizes the Holocaust survivor's unfathomable vulnerability or the shock of mass graves. Unlike the Holocaust survivor, who came to represent a shaken Western moral conscience, the global victim of genocide is a symbol of historically recent international responsibility for victims that has perhaps predictably not lived up to its own promises. The global victim represents betrayed political and ethical commitments in a world suffused with suffering, and Western calls to action often invoke not merely the victims, but also inevitable comparisons to the Holocaust. They do not do so only because Holocaust survivors have become paradigmatic, but also as if to anchor suffering in some particular event whose victims are morally unambiguous figures. For all of its abstraction from historical realities, the survivor, born of the West's recognition of its own murderousness barely 50 years ago, rendered victim suffering meaningful and authoritative by cleansing them of moral ambiguity and contention. The current victim symbol, instead, in conclusion, represents an empty universalism. It is not the symbol of particular suffering become paradigmatic, but it is symbolic of a universal promise of care. It is a symbol of all victims' utter innocence, of a global commitment to everyone's dignity no matter what, and at the same time, a historical legacy of moral ambiguity that explains the peculiar emptiness of the global victim's universalism. Thank you.
start by adding my voice to the chorus of praise to Jonathon and Jennifer for this really spectacular organization of this event, and to all of the speakers whose work has been just so inspiring. It's been great to sit here and listen to what people have been doing the last day and a half. So since it's why I'm here today, I'm going to start by talking about my book, Against the Unspeakable: Complicity, the Holocaust, and Slavery in America. That book was conceived in the 90s and published in 2006, right at the outset of the world of ubiquitous social media, or Web 2.0. I'm going to talk about that book, and then I'm going to talk about the age of new media and how Web 2.0 affects the premises of my argument in it. My title, Unspeakable 2.0, situates the unspeakable against, and against means both opposition and relationality, against this contemporary context. What does it mean to be against the unspeakable today, when experience is encoded, events are documented by digital cameras, information is disseminated by web publication platforms that are governed by obscure protocols, and social media encourage us to perform opposition and affiliation by liking and sharing images? The unspeakable means the rhetorical invocation of the limits of language, of comprehension, of representation, of thought, on the one hand, and a deferential gesture towards the incommunicability of trauma and pain, on the other. In the second half of the 20th century, increasingly sophisticated techniques of communication, documentation, preservation, think of film, sound recording, museums, and memorials, offer unprecedented access to a certain kind of knowledge, but make us painfully aware that something is missing. How can we remember a past that exceeds our comprehension? How do we speak about the unspeakable? This question surfaces again and again in the context of the Holocaust and racial violence. But it is, I submit, the wrong question to ask. It is the wrong question to ask because the unspeakable is not out there, an entity towards which we can gesture. It is a discursive production, our own discursive production, and it is recreated and reinforced whenever the limits of language are evoked. That discursive production, the forms it takes, the agendas that mobilize it, and its function in diverse contexts, was the subject of my book. Against the Unspeakable: Complicity, the Holocaust, and Slavery in America took as its starting point the rhetoric of unspeakability that came to surround the Holocaust in the 60s and 70s, the primacy of Adorno's to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, and version of that statement in the writings of George Steiner and Elie Wiesel. I trace the reverberations of these statements in the critical theory and philosophy of Jean-François Lyotard, Maurice Blanchot, Jacques Derrida, and in trauma theory of the 90s, Shoshana Feldman, Kathy Caruth, Dominic LeCapra. For all, I argued, the alignment of the Holocaust with the unspeakable lent real political and ethical urgency to the critical argument. The unspeakable is a powerful tool, but when it is wielded in contexts beyond the Holocaust, it seems to elicit charges of appropriation, what Michael Rothberg called the real estate model of memory. My study focused on literary and cinematic representations of the Holocaust and on novels and critical writing about slavery in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, not to compare these historical events, but to study how the unspeakable operates in narratives about each. What does evoking the unspeakable enable writers, authors, and critics to do? What does it make possible? What does it prohibit? For the African American scholars and artists I studied, language's limits serve simultaneously as a space of loss, marking the absence of language, of culture, of religion, of social and familial structures, all wrested away by the Middle Passage and slavery, and an articulation of presence in and through the discourse that was imposed in order to oppress. In politics, think of Malcolm X, and literature, think of Invisible Man. The unspeakable evinced what Henry Louis Gates Jr. calls the irony implicit in the attempt to posit a black self in the very Western languages in which blackness itself is a figure of absence, a negation. Linking the self with language's limits is a crucial tool for articulating the speaker's oppression and exclusion by the very language she employs, an assertion and reverberation of presence when race, as Toni Morrison put it, is a virtually unspeakable thing, accessible only through unspeakable things unspoken. Buttressed by the work of Spivak and Foucault, who linked discursive coherence to violence and power, and specifically in Spivak's critique of Foucault, locate experiential certainty beyond the discursive and in resistance to it, the unspeakable is a powerful instrument of political opposition, a productive vehicle for cultural identification. That's for the African American tradition. For writers about the Holocaust, on the other hand, the unspeakable's refusal of reference functions less as a point of entry into an exclusionary discourse, but rather to signal a departure from the ideologies and aesthetics of a brutal history. Language and culture are viewed as fundamentally contaminated, not because of where and how they failed, but because of where and how they succeed. Here, the unspeakable does not articulate experience, but marks its limits. Premised on the recognition that Hitler's regime, as Susan Gubar notes, depended on the deployment of elaborate rhetorical conceits and deceits, the art of restraint, hesitation, ambiguity, and stammer is mobilized against the forces of fascism. So the unspeakable serves quite a different function for these two bodies of work. What they do have in common is their shared ethos of resistance. How could they not, given the horrific legacy of American slavery and the Holocaust and the resilience of racism and anti-Semitism today? And yet, I argued, when this resistance takes the form of the unspeakable, of defining, articulating, and enforcing language's limits, it relies on a subtle legislation of agency. It is informed by the contention, an axiom for most post-structuralists, that representation is inevitably complicit in some form of hegemony. Jeffrey Hartman, speaking of this dilemma, put it thus: since we cannot get outside of language, how do we resist imposed forms of discourse without being contaminated by them? For Hartman, the choice is between how to speak and how not to speak. Silence offers a refuge from complicity, the illusion of a moral high ground. This illusion is something we cannot afford. That's how my opposition to the unspeakable and against the unspeakable led me to the topic of complicity. And I should clarify here that complicity is not the same as guilt and blame, and we can get into the niceties of these distinctions in the Q&A. Christopher Kurtz, a legal philosopher, figures complicity as a structure of relations, the mediation of agency to harm. For Mark Sanders, a scholar of apartheid, acknowledgement of complicity is a necessary condition for ethical engagement. Both Kurtz and Sanders figure complicity spatially, by the way. It is a domain of cultural and legal practices, as Kurtz puts it, or the grounds or footings from which opposition takes its first steps, as Sanders writes. This network, domain, grounds, or footing offered a more productive, because more multidimensional approach. Rather than the dichotomy of speech versus silence, representation versus its limits, complicity articulates the more complex dialectic that, Barbara Johnson notes, pertains to virtually all important investigations: the self-analyzing itself, man studying man, thought thinking about thought, language speaking about language. To designate that relationship as one of complicity is to identify complicity as a state of being, a being implicated in the being of other beings. To be against the unspeakable, I concluded, is to be complicit, and being complicit is the foundation for an ethical practice of memory. A dozen years have passed since I published that book, and as the title of this talk indicates, the unspeakable assumes a different form and function in the world of Web 2.0. Web 2.0, the term was popularized by Tim O'Reilly in 2004, names a fundamental shift in modern media culture after 2000, when the 1990s online publication model gave way to the more interactive social network model, and the ubiquity of mobile phones with high-quality digital cameras encouraged people to share and access information produced by others. What does it mean to be against the unspeakable in the echo chambers of 4chan, Reddit, and Instagram? What does it mean to occupy complicity's domain, when domain is a system that offers access to the internet, and occupy connotes collective embodied resistance to insidious institutional opacity? What does being complicit look like online, where agency is enacted via protocols that determine network access to spatially distributed beings, being cannot be distinguished from mediation, and mediation is intrinsic to our technological world. I cannot answer all these questions in under 20 minutes, but I can make a couple of points. First, the nature of resistance, so foundational for Holocaust studies and African American studies in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, changed in the post-Cold War era. You can't just be against migration, global capital, planet warming, or environmental catastrophe. These forces need to be managed and contained, negotiated, controlled. The subject must navigate the compelling and often conflicting demands of these forces, and in doing so is inevitably implicated in them. The dissociation of complicity from blame and guilt in legal studies and philosophy occurred at precisely this time, and people like Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and Debarati Sanyal built on Kurtz and Sanders' work by defining complicity structurally as a network or a formal relation to power, an inevitable condition of the neoliberal subject. My second point is that the crisis of the real My second point has to do with the crisis of the real precipitated by the shift from industrial to informational technologies in the late 70s and early 80s. Post-truth, a term we are all too familiar with, made its first appearance in the early 90s, the decade of the highly mediated First Persian Gulf War and the move from analog to digital reproduction. This move from analog to digital is quite significant for the crisis of the real. In analog reproduction, the light that touched the subject's face is the same light that I see when I look at a photograph. When the image is mechanically reproduced, the photograph may be printed or x-rayed or Xeroxed or even rephotographed. That light, what Walter Benjamin famously termed aura, remains imprinted in the arrangement of the granules of matter. The aura traces a fundamental continuity of the object and its image, infusing photography with an effect of the real. Digitization interrupts this continuity. With digitization, as Bernard Stiegler puts it, photons become pixels that are in turn zeros and ones on which discrete calculations can be performed. This happens in a digital night, a black box of code, inaccessible to human perception. Reality is no longer transmitted, it is manufactured, manipulated, not conveyed. It is stroked, tapped, and engaged with on our personal screens. My argument about the unspeakable was predicated on the fact that violence of genocide, slavery, and systematic disenfranchisement is real. Analog media contributed to this logic. The analog image, such as the photograph, implies that what was photographed was real. A manipulated photograph breaks this rule, but by breaking it underscores that it is in fact the rule. With digital technology, the luminous aura is replaced by the digital night, and the assumption of epistemic validity that what we see did indeed occur no longer resides in the image object. It is, rather, relocated to the narratives and discourses of verity that surround the image object. In the world of Web 2.0, these narratives and discourses are profoundly vulnerable to manipulation. Platforms like Twitter and Facebook are employed by terror organizations, nation-states, and canny ideologues alike to form and deform narratives that are constructed about events that may or may not have occurred, defined and driven by the platform's opaque algorithms and protocols. These narratives have very real effects in the ballot box, on the battlefields, in our hearts and minds. I said earlier that the unspeakable is not out there, an entity towards which we can gesture. It is a discursive production that is recreated and reinforced whenever the limits of language, of comprehension, and of thought are evoked. In the world of Web 2.0, a world informed and enabled by digital technology, reality is not out there, but is rather a discursive production, and it can be wielded as a weapon. Jared Peer has described how in the Black Lives Matter movement, the Brexit referendum, and of course the 2016 US presidential election, unknowing citizens collaborated with trolls, true believers, and bots to drive the news feed and spread disinformation. Mastery of the algorithms that drive trending topics provides coverage and legitimacy to conspiracy theories, fringe groups, and hostile governments. In this context, our agency is not our own. A story that speaks to me, an image that moves me, will incite me to like or share it. My agency in doing so may propel me may perpetuate a narrative that strikes at all I hold dear. The computer on which I've written these words may host a virus that connects to a botnet to form an effective zombie army directed by forces beyond my knowledge or control. I am not saying, God forbid, that we should renounce our personal electronic devices and delete our social media accounts. To do so would be to ignore the material reality of our globalized contemporary that, as Alan Liu writes, is not so much a pre-existing object as a standing wavefront of simulation. At this point, I want to remind you that against the unspeakable meant not only opposition but position. It set the subject in a structural relation with, not simply in opposition to, the atrocities and horrors of the 20th century, and it named that structural relation complicity. Today, the structural relation, this complicity, might best be located in our intimate relation with the technology through which we increasingly experience the world. When experience is encoded, events are documented by digital cameras, information is disseminated by web publication platforms that are governed by obscure protocols, our increasingly symbiotic relation with the devices and networks that mediate our experience needs to be the object of our attention. These reside at the intersection of computational space, cultural systems, and human cognition. And, as Ed Finn has noted, they require the interpretive methodologies of the humanities. Too often, those of us in the humanities respond to these abstract, forbidding sites of complexity and diversity with a gesture towards comprehension's limits. But every gesture towards something is also a gesture away from something, and by gesturing towards the unspeakable, we gesture away from ourselves. We disavow the material reality of our virtual lives, the impact of our actions in this world on other people in it, people whose diverse bodies, histories, memories, and experiences have brought us here today. We are bound together by fiber optic cable, radio waves, shifting bits, and spinning disks. Pointing and clicking establish facts on the ground, whether you are directing a drone or responding to a meme, whether you are a warrior for the military or for the cause of social justice. These are actions, and they have consequences, and we, historians, journalists, sociologists, and scholars of culture and philosophy, we have the tools to direct and define them. In the world of post-truth, alternative fact, co-opted affect, and weaponized agency, it is critical reading, image analysis, and attention to the affective nature of reception that can organize our presence in the network, produce for us the reality we seek, and define our increasingly virtual selves. Thank you.
Okay, I'm reading my paper off my iPad, which has decided to play games. Here we go. Mm-hmm. So thanks to John and for the invitation, and to the sponsors for bringing me over, and to Jenny for all the logistical help. I've got about 19 slides. Some of it's quite elementary, but I feel at this end of the day some visual prompts might help. And I do a lot of first-year undergraduate teaching, and you seem to visualize everything. So hopefully you won't find this beneath you. Now, this event is about comparative memory and justice in relation to the Holocaust and racial violence in America. But these issues are, of course, global. The colonial past is pressing itself upon us wherever you look. The former colonized and colonizer are now bound by thickening strands of contested memory about the crimes of empire. Hardly a day goes by without the press reporting a scandal or controversy about a past atrocity, whether slavery or genocide, ongoing negotiations to return stolen human remains, or to acknowledge and make reparations for genocide, or to announce a renovated colonial museum exhibition or discovery that reminds one of the enabling conditions for European prosperity since the early modern period. In the past few months alone, for example, the University of Glasgow announced its discovery of slave traders among its benefactors, and in response has embarked on what it calls a program of reparative justice. Prince Charles, on his trip to Ghana last week, spoke of the appalling atrocity, this is a quote, of the slave trade and the unimaginable suffering it caused, which left an indelible stain on our world. New museum displays in Portugal and Belgium attempt to display the dark side of their respective colonial paths, not going far enough for some citizens, including those of African descent, indicating how colonialism changed their demographies, and going too far for nationalist apologetics. Meanwhile, in Germany, Herero representatives of the Namibian government are confronting Germany with the genocide of 1904-05, while many in Germany deny that that colonial pacification campaign can be called genocide at all. At the same time, civil society groups are attempting to cleanse the German streetscape of colonial legacies by renaming streets that bear the names of colonial heroes, and for pushing for the return of colonial booty like the skull. Now, this cleansing of public space has its well-known American correlate, of course, in the toppling of Confederate statues and the debate about the Columbus statue in New York, which a number of you have mentioned. Less well-known here, perhaps, here in the US, is the echo in Australia, when in August last year, graffiti on the statues of colonial figures, Captain Cook, who supposedly discovered Australia in 770, and the early governor of New South Wales, Lachlan Macquarie, declared no pride in genocide. I don't know if you can see that there. I think, judging by the handwriting, it was the same culprit, and changed the date, referring to the date of our National Foundation Day, January 26, when the First Fleet pulled into Sydney on that day in 1788. It's not Australia Day, say Indigenous, and not just Indigenous critics, but Invasion Day. Now, the question of massacre and even genocide has been part of the Australian debate for decades now, even if on the margins. The mobilising potential and synergising effects of the US campaign to topple Confederate statues has led now, finally, to the eruption of the question of slavery in the Australian press, heretofore knowledge confined to historians and, of course, to the descendants of those slaves who were not deported after the end of the practice in the first years of the 20th century. The mobilisation comes from these descendants of so-called Kanakas from Fiji and other Pacific islands like Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea and Kiribati. The image on the right is one of the transport routes in which some 62,000 men and women were trafficked by British entrepreneurs in a process known as blackbirding. They were technically indentured labourers, but de facto slaves between 1863 and 1904 to work in North Queensland, mainly sugar plantations. Now their grandchildren want the statue of one of those entrepreneurs, Robert Towns, on the right, who founded the North Queensland town of Townsville, augmented with others that tell the full story. Interviewed last year, Imelda Davis, president of the Australian South Sea Islanders Association, said her grandfather had been kidnapped from the beach and brought to Australia when he was 12. She says, the Australian South Sea Islanders community in particular are advocating for the rightful inclusion of recognition in terms of the history of the Melanesian labourers that were brought to Townsville by Robert Towns. There's a monument in town to him that celebrates his wisdom in founding the township, but it goes to undermine the Australian Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and South Sea Islander history that occurred in Townsville, and it's a whitewash, and she goes on. Now, from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, on the left here, to Oxford in England, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign similarly challenged mnemonic practices successfully in the former. You can see here the crane lifting off successful Rhodes here, and then this part of this theatre group standing on the plinth in theatrical style. There's a long story connected with that, which we can't go into. And unsuccessfully, in the case of the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, there he is up there, behind a little cage to stop the pigeons crapping on him, frankly. But maybe protecting from the students. But the grandees and donors of Oriel College, who really are, in a sense, the legacies of empire, made it clear that they would not be repudiating Rhodes's legacy, and he remains. Now, if we train our gaze eastwards, we observe how the totalitarian past is at issue in Russia, which came up in one of the talks, where patriotic memory is being revived as a state project to stamp out critical memories of Soviet crimes to the Russian people. At the same time, those crimes are understood as colonial or imperial by the smaller nations from the Baltic to the Black Sea that were part of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact until the early 90s. That is, local nationalists, say Lithuanian, regard communist rule as a foreign occupation that committed genocide against their indigenous population. In these countries, a heated double genocide thesis debate is underway in which these anti-communist nationalists play off the Holocaust, in which their resistance heroes participated, against the Soviet occupation, thereby seeking to minimize the significance of the Holocaust and its memory that they regard as an alien memory regime imposed by righteous Germans as the cultural price to pay for full European membership. Thus, in Eastern and Central Europe, many have dared to compare, to evoke the title of this panel. But now, as many of you know, in 2000, a Native American Jewish master's student called Lillian Friedberg wrote a much-cited article in the journal American Indian Quarterly called Dare to Compare, Americanizing the Holocaust. As she later wrote, as a person of German, Jewish, Native American descent, I've got genocide written all over my genealogy, so it should come as no surprise that comparative genocide should be a topic of particular interest to me personally and professionally. Now, in this article, she assailed the clinical separation of Jewish and colonial memories of genocide, explicitly challenging the thesis of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. In its stead, like some before her, who also referred to an American Holocaust, particularly David Stannard in his book, and many since, she posited Native American genocide as a prototype of or model for the Nazi genocide of Jews, and Susan Neiman mentioned some Nazi quotations to that effect in her comments. Now, this was not a new debate, even 18 years ago, as Naomi Mandel has written in an article. The controversy about Toni Morrison's novel in 1987, Beloved, raised this issue in the book's dedication to 60 million and more. At the same time, in the late 1980s, Yehuda Bauer and Simon Wiesenthal engaged in a dispute about who counted among the Holocaust victims, and this was in the context of the planning of the Holocaust Memorial in DC. It was 6 million Jews, said Yehuda Bauer. It was 11 million, said Wiesenthal in response. 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews, so Roma and other victims. Now, the 1980s also saw the beginnings of the comparative genocide studies field, manifested first in undergraduate courses taught at a handful of universities in the US, virtually all by Jewish and Armenian social scientists. They rejected the uniqueness discourse of Stephen Katz and others, while regarding the Holocaust as a prototypical genocide against which others should be understood, sort of as an ideal type. In the subsequent decades, so throughout the 80s and 90s, they produced anthologies and encyclopedias based mainly on secondary literature, comparing and cataloguing genocide throughout the ages. Constituted mainly by social scientists in the US, the field was dominated by a nomothetic approach that seeks hard knowledge in the form of universal laws with predictive powers. Above all, the field sought to elucidate a general theory of genocide by identifying central elements in a genocidal conjuncture in the manner of a mathematical equation. Now, as with many social sciences, then the object of inquiry represents really a theory rather than investigates the complexities of cases or how they related to one another. And for this reason, the discipline necessarily proceeded comparatively to evoke one of the themes of the conference. Each country or genocide serves as a mine of information to test overarching concepts, laws, and models. And each case was considered basically independent from the other and was thus available for use as data in a social scientific experiment about dependent and independent variables. Now, implicit in this model was a developmentalist perspective which assumed that social change was endogenous, that is, domestic social structures drove change, or that social change was propelled by forces internal to societies. And consequently, the unit of analysis in genocide studies was then a society, usually a nation state. Now, the theoretical and comparative focus of the field led to a number of problems. For one, the literature became bogged down in a rather tedious and ultimately irresolvable definitional debate, which was only settled by disciplinary fiat. Usually people just refer to the UN Convention, as Carl said. Now, clearly these debates were unavoidable, for one cannot compare cases without having a common measure. But for reasons I'll suggest shortly, leading genocide scholars took the Holocaust as the paradigm of genocide, despite their ostensible rejection of Holocaust uniqueness. Ignoring or rejecting Raphael Lemkin's capacious definition of genocide, which included culture, as was mentioned just before, non-murderous techniques of genocide were rejected, and genocide was defined ultimately as an ideologically motivated and state-executed program of mass killing, particularly by totalitarian regimes. In a way, genocide studies became kind of an offshoot of totalitarianism studies. Now, the restriction of genocide's meaning in this way was not surprising in the 80s. The Cambodian auto-genocide had recently only occurred, and the colonial period had, of course, long passed in the Anglophone settler colonies. And there was also the Cold War imperative. Most North American genocide scholars were liberals for whom the answer to totalitarianism and genocide was the United States and its willing coalition partners. The rest of the world were like the US, so the thinking went, genocide would no longer occur. If the US was guilty of anything, it's of sins of omission, as Samantha Power argued in her well-known book, A Problem from Hell, in 2002. And Samantha Power was like a pin-up poster person in this field of genocide studies. Now, this approach dovetailed neatly with the implicit modernization theory in comparative genocide studies. Genocide occurred in failed states, was often the term, that experienced perverted modernizations. Had they followed the Western, preferably North American road to modernity, it was implied, they would not have become totalitarian states and perpetrated genocide against their own or neighboring populations. Leaving aside the fact that this rosy view ignores the fate of Native Americans, it can be identified as an American version of what we historians of Germany recognize immediately as a now highly suspect Sonderweg, or special path approach to comparative historical sociology. Either way, the US, and more generally the West, was regarded as a redeeming power in world affairs, whether as an agent of liberalization or as a cavalry that rescues victims from genocidal elites and their militias in the Third World. When Mark Levine, an important historian from the UK, suggested otherwise at a genocide convention in Minnesota in 2001, he was rebuked by leaders of the field with epithets like he was anti-American, ideological, and other such heresies. Yet how ideological is a position that wants to ignore the genocidal foundations of settler colonies like Australia and the US, and that questions the theodicy that the westernization of the globe will lead to a world in which genocide has been banished? Now, this was a context in which my generation, so graduate school in the 1990s, entered the field at the end of the 1990s, when we noticed the absence of colonialism and, on the one hand, in the field, and the presence of this muscular interventionism in Kosovo and then a few years later in Iraq with the first Gulf War, which was justified at least in part on humanitarian interventionist grounds. We saw a relationship between the two. Blindness to the violence of colonial conquest and assimilation was a product of a Western centrism that could issue in the support of most genocide scholars for hair-raising foreign policy adventures like the US and its Australian allies. And we'll never forget Michael Ignatiev's piece in the New York Times magazine, The Burden, I think in 2003. Now, at the same time, as we were thinking, as we ourselves were working on PhD projects or side projects on colonial history, whether of Australia and in Germany, in this case, Jürgen Zimmerer's PhD thesis book on the left, Deutsche Herrschaft über Afrikaner, and then later his important co-edited book on the genocide in Southwest Africa is also an English version. Now, it was natural that we turned to developments in colonial historiography, especially the settler colonial analytic, to understand the early histories of places like Australia, Canada, and the US. A growing body of work uses this analytic to highlight the genocidal impact of these histories. On the left there we have a new journal called Settler Colonial Studies, which is terrifically important. Now, to a great extent, we were also influenced by critical historiography of empire inspired by Arendt, Césaire, and Fanon that led some of us to rethink the Holocaust now in colonial terms. Well, first of all, some slides on the settler colonial work. here, Canada, North America. Carl mentioned the book on the right by Ben Madley. And you can see there's really a thickening historiography that's developing in this field, which is very important. Now, but we also now started to think about the Holocaust as colonial, inspired also by Lemkin's broad definition of genocide in his analysis of the occupation regimes of the Nazis and their allies in his wartime book, Access Rule in Occupied Europe, which contained the striking quotation, which we have here. Genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor. This imposition, in turn, may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain upon the territory alone, or after the removal of the population and the colonisation by the oppressor's own nationals. This looks like settler colonialism to many of us who came out of colonial history. Now, inspired by his conceptualization of genocide as intrinsically colonial, I edited a book on genocide and empire in world history. That's the one on the left. And my compatriot, it's no accident that many Australians are doing this, Ben Kiernan up at Yale, wrote a monumental book on genocide and world history that has many of the same themes as well as some others. Now, this in turn led to a spirited debate that contested this contextualization, and that debate is still going on. The particular role of anti-Semitism is mainly the issue here as well, as the enduring question of the Holocaust distinctiveness, or as one protagonist puts it, the question of whether the Holocaust is, quote, just another, unquote, atrocity or genocide in world history. That seems to be the main anxiety. Now, the title of these books highlights the issues. Kitty Millett, who teaches Jewish studies and literature in San Francisco, did this book on the victims of slavery, colonization, and the Holocaust. So mirrors very much the title of this conference. A comparative history of persecution, whose purpose is to highlight the differences between these phenomena, contesting quite explicitly this historiography I've mentioned, which he thinks lumps it all together. And then you have Gab Rosenfeld, who's a friend and contemporary, his book Hi Hitler, where the anxiety is about the normalization of the Nazi past. I'm never quite sure what that means, but that's the theme of the book. Now, the anxiety here is really one of comparison, understood as equation. But that's not really what me and colleagues like Jürgen Zimmerer are proposing. We're trying to move beyond a comparative logic to a deeper historical one of entanglement, to get to the title of my talk. Rather than assert an American or Australian Holocaust, as some activists might, we're interested in what the sources tell us, that Hitler and other Nazis were keen observers of British and American histories, among others, and that opportunistically they asserted the ruthlessness of the British and American conquests to license their own. To understand what the Nazis were doing, for instance, we need to understand how and why they thought what they were doing, how they explained their actions to themselves and to others. Entangled historiography breaks down tidy units of analysis like nation-states and even empires, and sees how they're constituted in interaction through multiple vertical and horizontal forces and threads that cross borders. Interaction, circulation, transfers, and adaptation are the operative nouns in this historiography. It owes much to the spatial turn and to post-colonial historiography that takes, for instance, the colony and the metropole as a single unit of analysis rather than as separate ones. In sociology and in literary studies, David Theo Goldberg has pushed in the same direction by counterposing the comparative with what he calls the relational method of studying racial formations. Now, taking this perspective means challenging the terms in which Millett's comparison between victims of colonization, slavery, and the Holocaust are posed. Rather than comparing genocide, the Holocaust, and slavery, an entangled or relational perspective allows us to see how all three elements were present in the beginning of the imperial formation and process that began in 1492, and whose consequences we're confronting today in Trump's regime. Any closer reading of the Holocaust will reveal colonization and slavery as well as extermination as intrinsic to the experience of victims, Jewish victims as well as other victims of the Nazis, just as extermination and slavery were intrinsic to virtually all colonial experiences. South American Indians were worked to death in their millions in silver mines run by the Spanish in the 16th century, and millions others died of disease and starvation, as we've heard a bit about today already. And dying of disease and starvation was one of the main fear of and by Jews, if you're in Polish ghettos, to evoke a number of other themes we've heard about today, until 1943, if you follow the Jewish press during the Second World War on a week-by-week basis. Because to some extent, because the knowledge of what was going on in Auschwitz was sort of delayed and vague and so forth. But there was good knowledge about what was going on in various ghettos in Poland through underground sources, and the big anxiety until April 43, I've seen, is about starvation and disease in ghettos, very similar to many colonial cases. It's no accident that the category of social death could easily move between the literature on slavery and the Holocaust. Remember, Goldhagen talked about social death in Hitler's willing executions. And one can also discern similar patterns of governing the abject. For example, the appointment of some, like favoured slaves in one case, capos in the other, to enforce the will of the exploiting ruler. Now, the point is not to press home a flattening logic of equation, but to see how the logics of imperial expansion since the early modern period have resulted in differing combinations of slavery, colonization, and extermination, depending on circumstances, in the interest of state security and efficient resource extraction. We need to remember the role of contingency as well. Had the Germans prevailed against the Soviets in late 1941-42, the genocide of European Jewry might have resembled more the US Trail of Tears, as Jews were, as was planned, to be deported to the east to die of exposure and neglect, like the millions of Russian POWs had experienced already in late 1941. I want to end by linking this history to our present moment. The birth of European empire in the Latin American case was simultaneously the birth of its critique, beginning with the Salamanca School of Theologians, led by Vittoria and Las Casas. They assailed the violence and exploitation of the conquistadors, their own people, their fellow Spaniards, and insisted on the property and other rights of indigenous Indians. This is very well known, of course, but they were not anti-imperialists. They entreated a humanitarian Christian empire that ruled benevolently over the otherwise culturally backward natives whom they wanted to convert. Now, this strand of critique continued into abolitionism in this country and in the UK, and manifests itself today in the liberal internationalism of I2P and the Samantha Powers of this world. The emphatically anti-imperial critique came mainly from the enslaved themselves and the exploited, spectacularly, say, in the leaders of the rebellion in Haiti, and by Europeans in the tradition of later Marxism, or especially those Marxists who were themselves also subordinates like C.L.R. James and Eric Williams. And we could, of course, mention many more. The uneasy relationship between these two different types of critique of empire, one sort of mild critique that promotes a humanitarian empire, and one that's emphatically anti-imperial, the uneasy relationship between them became apparent after the successful alliance between Jews and blacks in the civil rights movement, with which this conference began yesterday with Susanna Heschel's terrific paper. Nothing is to be gained by ignoring the differences between them today. Has anyone read the Black Lives Matter statement on Palestine? I don't think it would be acceptable to most Jewish groups in this country, some of which have used the Pittsburgh massacre to press home laws outlawing BDS, as if BDS has anything to do with the mass shooting in Pittsburgh. The question then is whether these and other groups, can rally around an agenda of confronting the snarling, patriarchal, racist, resource-extracting logic of empire that currently governs this country and mine. My wager, my historiographical wager, is that an entangled history of empire and genocide can cement the bonds necessary for solidarity among different minority groups, rather than the intrinsically competitive potential of comparative analysis. Do we identify with the conquistadors, as the right effectively do, or with other historical forces? Dare to compare, we're asked in this panel. I say instead, dare to share, I know that's very corny, dare to share and identify, and it was too tempting to not to use, and to identify with the continuous and conjoined histories of suffering and resistance. These are stories and energies we need today, and I'm gratified to have heard some of them at this conference. Thank you.
John, is that information that we should all know? Like logistical information?
You can feel free to respond first.
So look, even if I had more than 15 minutes, I would not try to summarize this conference. I also think it's fair that each of the speakers get a chance to answer at least a few questions. Just a couple of words then, trying to tie some things together. I actually think we're all on similar, if not exactly the same pages. We're all thinking about, as Dirk nicely put it, not the flattering logic of equation, but ways to construct a universality with enough nuance to say these different kinds of evils, I get to say, as a philosopher, these different kinds of evils need to speak with each other and to each other. My question is always about the political and contemporary consequences of doing that. And I get crazy when the sorts of people you were talking about who want to look at the Holocaust as absolutely unique and not relevant to anything else. That's a political statement. And it's been used in insidious and quite horrible ways, or is used currently, not only, alas, in the state of Israel, but in the representatives that it's sent to Pittsburgh. So I think we're all basically on the same page, and we want to think about how those differences matter, or do they really? And of course, sometimes they do. Again, I'm focusing partly on Dirk because he was the last speaker and I was making notes here, but partly because, well, anyway. You talked about a difference between scholars versus activists. And we want scholarship to inform activism, but for political reasons, it seems to me. Because it is politically useless and pointless for people to talk about an American Holocaust or an Australian Holocaust. It brings up the wrong sorts of things, and there's the Holocaust on your plate. Let's leave it, okay? But I suppose the only thing that I really want to emphasize is that given that we all are roughly on the same page and working in tremendously different fields, which I have learned from myself, and I gather everybody else has, what are we going to do with it? And I was very glad that you mentioned Black Lives Matter at the very end, because I realize I'm in a conference of mostly historians, but all of us know that these are not times in which intellectuals can stand in the shadows and opine about these things. This goes back to, is Yulia still here? No, maybe she's not. Anyway, a point she was making about language. And some of the points that Naomi was making about unspeakability. So I'm really not a post-structuralist. And I've never been a post-structuralist. And I hold the post-structuralists seriously responsible for some of the trouble that we're in now. So I'm laying my cards on the table as someone, you know, who may not be sympathetic to some of the discourse that you were quoting in your description of your earlier book, which I'm still interested in reading, even though I'm not a post-structuralist. My feeling about unspeakability is we need to learn how to speak better. And you know, if you think of the people who, even just about the Holocaust, at moments that I thought I could not read another word about the Holocaust, I discovered Ruth Kluger or Jeanne Marie, who's one of my biggest heroes, not as well known in this country as he should be. That is, if we work at our language and bringing it outside of the university, we can do an awful lot more than I think we. I feel I've learned from this conference. I feel just slightly frustrated because I think this is a time in history where we need to reach out beyond our own fields of discourse. Professor Martinez, whose first name I forgot, pardon? Monica, thank you, gave us some very good examples, and I know that some of the other people here are involved in those projects. My hope is simply, despite the points that you make about living in a virtual world, there is, you said, God forbid, there is the option of living less virtually. I mean, one can get off social media, one can disconnect more often. It's really possible to have a life without it. My request, my hope, my plea is that we use some of this scholarship, that we distill some of the scholarship, that we learn to organize. Yeah, so with that, I'm done with what I have to say. I think the speakers should get a chance to answer questions.
So, yes, the floor is open. We have 25 minutes until the glass of wine.
Oh, I thought it was 6:30.
Yeah, we can extend it.
We were given permission to go
so.
longer.
Well,
But that just depends.
so it was the wine out there.
Very interesting. I think one of the virtues of Dirk's opening up the genocide concept and making it more capacious without descending into comparative victimology is that it allows you to see the history of genocide as a concept discursively differently, even from the very beginning. For example, the issue around the Genocide Convention in the 1940s and early 1950s was not the Holocaust, it was lynching. Because the Southern senators opposed the ratification of the Genocide Convention on the grounds that it would lead to the trial of American citizens in foreign courts. I just want to make a small point.
Can you, that's, I don't know that either, that's extremely interesting. Can you give us a reference here for those?
You're writing an article about it.
Yeah.
We send it to you?
Elizabeth Borgward to this work on
Sorry?
Elizabeth Borgward.
Yeah, Carolyn Anderson has stuff on it in her book on civil rights and genocide.
Right.
Thanks so much for the panel. I was interested in the question of agency and the internet. I was really compelled by that and whether there is agency or how it works. And I was thinking about sort of the algorithm, and you seem to be just characterizing it as something that is imposed upon us, but there is sort of also an element in which it attempts to model or pattern our future behavior based on our past behavior. So in that sense, it's also kind of, I mean, in that sense, we sort of do, if not control it, at least unleash it, or however you want to phrase that. It's kind of an anticipatory thing as much as it is something that is imposed. So I don't know if you had, I was kind of very compelled by the idea that you raised, and I don't know if you have further thoughts on it.
Well, I think that we have it's a symbiotic relationship that we have. The symbiotic relationships we have with our devices that are always with us, that we're always kind of touching and accessing. And we have a symbiotic relationship with the algorithms as well that determine, what it is that we're touching and accessing. And if you're going to have a symbiotic relationship with something, you better learn about it. Learn what it is that you're living with and what it is that's living with you. When these algorithms are proprietary technology and closely guarded secrets by, let's say, Google and Facebook, then then I get worried, and I think for good reason. But they don't need to be, and our interactions with the algorithms. I mean, you're right. We have the power to form our Facebook feed and determine what's going to show up at the top and what's not, and what's going to miss us. Like but we also have the power to determine what counts as news. When for a while there, during the run-up to the U.S. election, Facebook was, the Facebook news feature was being propelled by likes and shares and that sort of thing, and the craziest stories got propelled to the top of the news feature, and that's how fake news became real news, because if something's trending on Facebook, the New York Times is going to cover it, and all of a sudden, Breitbart News can quote the New York Times for the story that was planted there. Anyway, so this is the dialectic and relationship that we need to study. This is within this human-machine interface is where we're going to live from now on. You're right, I probably shouldn't have characterized the algorithms as opaque that just determine us, but they are still opaque. It's hard to access them and figure out how they're structured and how they're structuring the information we're
Naomi, could I
Please.
ask a question? I mean, I'm sure you're not implying that there's a binary between there was an authentic news in the past, it's inauthentic now.
No.
Far too sophisticated. But when you think of colonial scandals, we all know, for example, that the Belgian king, when setting up the colony in the Congo, paid people to plant favourable stories in the press so that investors would, there's always this manipulation going on. So, I mean, how different really is this?
Well, I can answer, but
Yeah.
you can answer too, if you'd like.
Well, no, I didn't. I was also bothered, and I didn't want to go on too long for a variety of reasons. The least important of which is that it will come off as anachronistic. But I was disturbed by your discussion of agency, because I think there's a real tendency of people, and it's a bit generational, to roll over and simply say, well, we have a symbiotic relationship with our devices, and that's just, we live in a virtual world. And it's not necessary. I agree that we need to learn more about the algorithms. I agree that they're, they shouldn't be as opaque as they are to us. But the truth of the matter is, one can resist it. I mean, I sort of look at the devices as like alcohol. A couple glasses of wine is fine, and too much will really get you in trouble. So I would love it if we could stop talking about symbiotic relationships and have much more instrumental relationships with our devices.
Well, I can add, okay, so how different is contemporary, the contemporary talking about fake news from the way news has always worked with, being staged and planted stories and that sort of thing. When there's a top-down method of media, and it's about disseminating a certain message to an audience, we have that top-down thing, then it's a little easier to form a critical relationship with it. You have the most exciting and critical relationship with media in totalitarian regimes, where the media is entirely controlled by the government. Then people really know how to read carefully and unpack but in the world of social media, it's not a top-down broadcast. you get the news you want from the people you want to hear from. That's our news feed is formed by the algorithms that know what we want and what we're inclined to a little better than we do even.
We have a couple of questions. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's the difference between the broadcast method and the social media method. As for what you say, Susan, I'm sorry, I think it is generational. And I have to say that as someone for whom, and I think a lot of young people, I'm not that much younger than you, but I think a lot of young people, the internet opens up the world to them, and I would never want to give that up. I would never want to tell, a kid in, some Palestinian kid, for example, not to be streaming illegally downloaded HBO, because that's the currency that you're going to fight with and use, and that's where it's
Again, I love drinking wine, and so I'm not an absolute anti-internet. I just think, and I know many people of the next generation below me who've actually discovered the pleasures of being offline sometimes. It feels like having your brain washed. I do it in the other way. I do it on a regular basis. So anyway, we could go on for a long time about this.
We have quite a few questions. We'll start here.
Me?
Yes.
So this is a question for Carolyn. And let me just say that I really enjoyed this panel. Very powerful. I kind of missed that, but I was really interested in your algorithm, so to speak. In other words, how you measure from that, that graph, the transformation or the globalization of the survivor. I teach on that in all my memory courses, and I go back to Lipton and so on. So can you just clarify that? What did you measure? Was it academic literature? Was it more journalistic literature? I somehow missed that.
Yeah.
That kind of, the upswing of.
Yeah, I'm sorry, it was a very distilled version of a much longer book, and what happens is things fall out. So I do it through trials. There were several trials in Europe, beginning right after the interwar period, the Eichmann trial, and I used David Rousset, who was a figure in, Phil's no longer here, but who was a figure in post-war France, when there was a witness, and who developed a whole concept of the witness through defamation trials that precedes, that starts focusing on victims and the authority of the victim's voice, though, again, as a resistance fighter. And so what I'm interested in is a broad shift from the authority of the dismayed spectator, which is the authority of the civilized spectator, looking at atrocities, and I'm thinking of the late 19th and early 20th century, when you're talking about atrocities are things that happen elsewhere to other people, and they are talked about in terms of horrors, right? You see the outrage, the horrors, that's how 19th century discourse talks about what takes place in distant lands. And that begins to shift with war, the Great War, and the experiences of veterans who witness it. Abolitionism begins this, but it really, and so if you think about the Armenian genocide, Toynbee is the person who brings the Armenian genocide, the idea that it happened, credibility. In Germany, it's a guy named Lepsus, Johannes Lepsus, who is a pastor, he's a German colonialist, but he basically does all this research, and the Armenians are Christians, so that's what he's invested in. And so he brings it, and their voices are much more credible than the victims of pogroms, especially. They're all documenting away and taking pictures, but nobody will listen to them because they're victims, and they need for credibility. They need other people to represent them. That begins to shift. And if you look at these trials, which I obviously can't talk about, one happens in Berlin in 1921, another in Paris in the 20s. And then there are several in Paris about Soviet camps. And then we get to the Eichmann trial, which is the only one people talk about, which has more in common with all these quite irregular trials than it does. And through these trials, the witness begins to, this witness figure begins to emerge. And that's what really interested me, was how to, so that's how I tracked it. And then,
I just meant from 85 on, you know, when the
oh, you, oh, I'm sorry.
What did
Yeah.
was it through trials as well?
It's through the discourse on human rights is what
Discourse
happens.
of human rights.
Yeah,
I see.
yeah,
So
I'm sorry.
more public discourse.
Yes, it's a couple of things together. It's the globalization of the Holocaust as a metaphor for all other kinds of destruction. So the Vietnam War, as in the 60s, as people were trying to militate against the Vietnam War, and in various, what do you call it, people's tribunals, Jean-Paul Sartre, they talk about Oradour, right? The Vietnam, the bombing of the Vietnamese is similar, or massacres at My Lai are similar to the Nazi murder of Jews at Oradour. They talk about the German, they make all kind, everything is compared to the Holocaust. This begins in the 60s as there's the rise of civil rights, as all this happens. That is one thread. The other thread is the discovery later of PTSD and trauma, and the dissemination of trauma to describe all kinds of experiences of
But
events.
in the public media, newspapers, I just want to know
Yeah.
the medium that you use to track that.
Oh, it's
Or in more intellectual
yeah.
discourse,
There are
or-
three. I use the International Criminal Court discourses about that, and the trials and what happens to the testimony of victims over time, which is radically different now. The same thing with, I use human rights, critiques of human rights to try to track what happens to PTSD and how it gets used. And of course, there's a whole discourse about that. There are several others. And atrocity, I use photography, discourses and debates about atrocity photography to talk about how the debates, curatorial and other, about atrocity photography actually make clear how we've shifted. There are also anthropological discussions of humanitarianism, so.
We have three, one and two.
This was one of these, because this is the last session, the last panel, I thought I'd ask one of these sort of summing up questions, which is just, I was curious where the panelists felt like, because we've sort of, ideally we're trying to learn from one another, people are studying different experiences and also thinking about a research agenda going forward, and so I was just curious what people felt maybe they had learned from each other during the conference, and what sort of new research people felt what sort of needed to be done as a result of having been at this conference.
Sorry, the other questions?
My question is, these last couple of days we've been talking a lot about memory, and I'd be curious from the panel what your thoughts are on forgetting and whether that's ever appropriate. It seems to me that forgetting is kind of intrinsic to the process of recording and also somewhat connected with, foundational with human health and flourishing in some ways. I've been spending some time with Nietzsche's on the uses and disadvantages of history for life and his thoughts on forgetting as being a part of human living. So I would just be interested in any comments on forgetting in this discussion.
Okay, last question?
I'll pass first.
Okay, so we have.
Okay,
yes.
yeah, this is I think Carl's question is a closing question, mine is sort of an opening up, but it was just an invitation to think through, especially speaking to public audiences and engaging with people who are trying to think through all of the different ways in which oppression and hate is being felt. And one thing that I did notice is that there were not many references to sexual violence, and so the particularities. And so I was actually wondering from Dirk Moses, from the installation of the efforts to engage critically with these histories, if there were different corollaries to the efforts to be critical about the Sims monuments in New York that commemorate and celebrate, the scientific, the development of the field of gynecology and the practice on enslaved women in the United States. So I wonder if there are other case studies that are similar that help us think specifically about sexual violence, either in the experience of genocide or slavery.
So let me start with Dirk, and then we'll go to the forgetting question and then the new research.
Okay, I don't know much about correlated monuments like the one you mentioned, but certainly in the jurisprudence literature on genocide, there's a lot on sexual violence because of developments out of the ICTR. Because of one judgment in the Rwanda case, one of the articles of the Genocide Convention, which mentions in very vague terms, torture and so forth, sexual violence can be classed as that, if it's linked to this intent to destroy. So, in other words, sexual violence can be an act of genocide in certain circumstances. And that certainly put that issue on the radar. And of course, feminist IR scholars have been at the forefront of that literature in the scholarly domain since the 90s because of mass rape allegations in Yugoslavia. So that's been a pretty intensive political science and legal debate for the last 30 years, actually. I know less about the sort of if you like, mnemonic practices and memorials, but there's important scholarly literature and colonial literature that Carl know more about, where gender issues are necessarily brought in because families are so central to indigenous experiences after the frontier is closed and violent conquest is concluded. You have indigenous people on the inside of the frontier, and then these settler states have to figure out what to do with them. And usually they oscillate between policies of segregation and protection, as you know, or assimilation. And either way, getting hold of children away from their mothers is like the central policy imperative, and gender issues are quite central. A lot has been written about that, as you know, but it's led to a really vibrant comparative field. Australia, Canada, US and New Zealand are very, because people can read English to some extent, but has led to really interesting historiography there. I'll leave that for now, and we'll come back to the...
Time for discussion, Does
Yeah.
anyone care to...
I can say a word about forgetting, because I have thought about it. David Reef wrote a book a couple of years ago, maybe you read it, In Praise of Forgetting. Interestingly enough, his favorite example is the Irish example, which is a quite complicated one, and somebody proposed the best solution in Ireland, an Irish woman, would be to make a monument to amnesia and forget where we put it. And having spending a lot of time in Ireland, it's an interesting example. Interestingly enough, Reef doesn't talk about the German case at all, which is quite problematic. Basically, I think the problem with forgetting is it doesn't work. And I think nothing shows this better than the hostility that Barack Obama got while he was president, and the ways in which racism is coming out, has been coming out basically ever since he took office, and most powerfully and horribly in the last couple of years. That is, I think Obama really did think that, there are no red states, blue states, black, white, etc. And if we concentrate on the ideals that unite us, we can all move forward. I used to be much more convinced of that view myself, and I just think the last 10 years of American history show the ways in which these completely repressed stories, this idea of America as the greatest nation that dare not be criticized, usually, by the way, propagated by people who've never been outside it, but that's another thing. I think we just have a glaring example in front of us that it doesn't work.
Okay, last part. Anyone care to talk about new directions in research?
I thought mine was backward research. I really learned a lot. I didn't know much about that, and I thought your various, which I looked up your website, and you had them up there as well. There's various sites in which you engage students as well to do research on the text of borderlands and other sites of violence. Was really inspiring in a way of getting history outside the profession and into not out of the classroom and into that reality, as you were saying, Susan. I thought that was really good. It reminded me of a project that a colleague of mine is doing in the University of Newcastle, north of Sydney, which is a massacre, an interactive massacre map of Australia, which is, I think there was an article about it in the New Yorker a while ago. So I know her quite well. She published it in our journal and so forth. The big issue there is documentation at a sufficient level of precision in order to ward off denialists. And I'm sure you're facing that as well. But this is, it's online, everybody can see it, and then people mail in, especially people in rural areas, say, oh, yeah, my grandfather mentioned, this site, and then archaeologists go out and they find bones. And, they can date all this stuff now. And so it's really involving the public in these research projects. I think that's really terrifically hopeful.
Well, thanks to all four of you.